Let's begin first of all, Cees, by looking at what you find out. Give us just a general sense of the findings that you have.
I wrote a fun piece last week where I took a somewhat longer view of the world than what people are usually doing. I specifically refer to the fact that in Asia, for example, you've got 8 to 10% growth going. In the West, which is going through its troubles, you've got 2% growing. Both these areas contribute about a half to world GDP at this point in time. So when you add them up and you divide by 2, you're getting a growth performance of the order of 4 to 5% per annum. Now, if you go back over the last 200 years of industrial development, a 4 to 5% growth rate is a very high growth rate. It is not at all a growth rate that gives you an indication of being deep in crisis. So although some parts of the world at this moment in time are very much struggling to come back from what they experienced, in fact, the world is actually not doing too badly at all in an overall context. And if you project that forward, in other words, if specifically Asia will continue to perform along these lines, and the Western world, the rich world, although they will be struggling, will at least be growing ever so slowly, but they will be growing. Then the world will continue to expand and to gain, and the West will get over its problems of the moment. And in time you will find, in fact, that the world leaves these problems behind. Now, when you then ask, where does Africa fit into this? Well, Africa, of course, already for some decades is essentially a commodity play, at least where the world is concerned. And especially the industrial development in Asia, which is very heavily commodity intensive. Africa, in other words, is piggybacking on that Asian experience. It's not just Africa. I mean, Australia is doing it, Brazil is doing it, Russia is doing it. So the commodity areas of the world are having an assist, if you wish. And in the case of Africa, this is very important because it is heavily underdeveloped and it has basically very little else at this point which can support it. So the commodity story at this point in time and considering the years that lie ahead are extremely important, I think, for this continent to have another chance at its development.
Now, of course, when we talk about Africa, we talk about the commodities and we talk about China and the impact that it's having. Going back into history, I remember the years when people spoke about paper tigers, when China was developing and they had boasting their billions of people, whereas other parts of the world, it wasn't such a, they didn't have as many people. When you look at Africa and the kind of issues that are playing out and the kind of attraction that Africa is posing for international business people, do you get a sense that enough is being made of the growth of the African consumer, if you like, and the size of our market in today's economic planning and the developments that we're seeing around commodities?
I cannot speak on behalf of the world, but certainly South African quoted companies all have this larger African market very much in focus. And when you analyze their annual statements, the extent to which they have already expanded into Africa, of course it is a very fragmented continent, I mean there are over 50 countries, but certainly compared to say 10 years ago, there is a far greater presence of South African companies. I cannot speak on behalf of other continents.
Sure.
And certainly the continent has been identified for that very reason which you've just highlighted, which is consumer purchasing power, which is income, on a level and to an extent that comes as a surprise to many people, but it is very real. It offers very real opportunities. And as I say, today, when you speak to a company, the first question you really want to ask is not so much about local performance as that what is your strategy going into Africa? You wouldn't have done that 10 years ago. I think you will do it today.
Yeah. Now, what we're also finding is that if you look back, I think in the last decade or so, when ShopRite started going into Africa, I think most analysts here probably the trend wasn't broad, if you like. What we found was that ShopRite was a lone ranger in many respects, and you also find your Standard Bank, again, a lone ranger. The question I want to pose to you is, did South African companies miss the boat, if you like, the majority of South African companies, particularly the big ones, in trying to get into Africa?
I'm not so sure about missing the boat, because I don't identify the boat.
Hasn't it gone? Is it still around?
I think the boat is only actually now been identified, and not just by South African companies. I think it is a worldwide phenomenon. And yes, the income is there now. And specifically the growth is there now. So I think South Africa is very much riding the wave, riding the crest of the wave, rather than falling behind or being behind or having to catch up. I don't have that impression at all. If anything, I think South African companies, the better companies, and it applies to nearly every sector of the economy, probably have an advantage over other parts of the world because they know the continent, they are of Africa. So I would not want to think that they have missed the boat or are coming from far behind. No, not at all. I think they're very much part of the story.
But what about the greater competition? Because now we're seeing at the same time Indian companies looking into Africa. We're now also seeing Russian companies coming into Africa. We are now also seeing companies, as we said, from China coming into Africa.
Well, in other words, the greater the opportunity, the greater the flocking in of competition. And I don't think we should be afraid of that. In fact, it is a confirmation of the growth story that is available. And is there enough for all? And in that respect, going back to the piece that I've written, I've taken a very long and a very positive view of the world, but then also of the continent, that yes, with the kind of growth rates we're talking about, the opportunities that are ultimately going to be there, not just as an exporter of commodities, but then ultimately also of the domestic markets and the incomes that are going to be available. So I don't think our companies should be too concerned or too afraid that the competition is coming. I think it is merely a confirmation of an enormous growth opportunity.
Yeah, you know, I find it quite interesting. We're no longer talking about the third world. We're now talking about the emergent world, and I quite like that, because the fact that we're no longer talking about something that's a backwater, but we're talking about something that could potentially emerge. But within that emergent set, you've got Asia, which potentially have to translate a lot of growth that's busy happening there into African opportunity. And I find that the interaction between Asia and Africa is potentially far more on trade lines than it has been with the West, which has been on aid lines. Do you see that trend kind of continuing? And from your perspective, an African country which is kind of high up on the FDI type of list, apart from South Africa, what could that country, and who could that country be?
Sorry, there's a lot of questions there. I think China has a global strategy in terms of commodity needs, given the state of its industrialization, its relative lack of own endowment. So it is looking around the world, and it is looking for safe parts of the world, relatively speaking. And Africa, I think, has very much been targeted in that respect by China. So China is there for the commodity angle, but at the same time it has also, I think, identified the African market to offload its own industrial products. So it is a two-way street ultimately. The Indian story, I think, is somewhat different. That is far more a trading kind of story. But where there is income, there is an opportunity, and basically the Chinese are creating their own opportunity by creating the markets for the commodities. So it is something that they are intimately engaged with, part of, and in that respect, I suppose, other parts of the world are onlookers. China is involved in this story, and so is India. But you were asking about specific countries? Yeah,
I was just going to ask that, apart from South Africa is usually a fairly large recipient of FDI in an African context. Which other country in Africa could potentially be the next biggest recipient of FDI, and what, from a political, just from an economic perspective, what kind of changes do they need to potentially look at making to potentially attract more FDI?
You make a list of the commodities and you rank them, and you rank the appetite, and you got your answer, and you start with energy. So the Angolas of this world, the Mozambiques, I suppose, but the Nigerias, the Cameroons, Sudan, given the potential that apparently is there. But it isn't limited to oil. I think it goes much wider than that. I'm not that particularly knowledgeable on the specific endowments that we have everywhere. Zimbabwe, for example, comes into focus not quite as part of the story generally, but certainly in terms of its platinum endowment, for example. And so you can work down the list. And as I say, 10 years ago, it wasn't really on the horizon, on the radar screen, but today it is major.